The first time I realized my nephew might be helping someone kill me, I was standing in the lighting aisle at Bennett Hardware with a packet of greenhouse bulbs in one hand and a blue tin of cedar balm in the other. An old woman I half recognized from my late wife's church quilting table put one hand over mine and said, very quietly, "When Adam brings that tin to your house, do not let it touch your skin again. Rub it on silver and leave it by the window overnight." Before we go any further, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from, your city or your country. I read more than people think. Stay with me, because this story is not just about a suspicious gift. It is about $11.8 million, a family betrayal, a hidden medical scheme, and the moment my wife's final protection turned their own plan against them. I thought grief had made her theatrical. I almost smiled. I almost told her she had the wrong man. Then she said, "By Sunday they expect you to sign away the conservancy." That stopped everything. Because the conservancy was not a sentimental little patch of land with a plaque and a picnic bench. The Miriam Hanley Shoreline Conservancy sat on 23 acres of riverfront glasshouse property, Orchard Rose, and old boathouse land outside Port Canaan. Two independent appraisals had put it at a little over $11.8 million after the developer money came flooding toward the shoreline last year. It was the largest thing my wife and I had ever built, and the only reason it still belonged to the town instead of a private buyer was that Miriam had tied it up in trust so tightly nobody could shake it loose. "Who are you?" I asked. She did not answer that first. She looked at the tin in my hand, then at me, and said, "If you want to live long enough to understand what your nephew has done, test it. Silver. Overnight. Then call the number in your left coat pocket." I had no number in my left coat pocket. Or I thought I did not. Then she pressed my wrist once, dry fingers, hard enough to mean this was not a social moment, and walked away down the paint aisle without looking back. I stood there in the fluorescent hum of Bennett Hardware with the blue tin in my hand and the packet of bulbs slipping against my palm. My name was Martin Hanley. I was 69 years old. I had spent 42 years working as a millwright before I retired, which meant I trusted wear patterns, stress lines, and things that left marks. I did not trust cryptic women in quilted coats giving me instructions in aisle 7. And yet I put my hand in my left coat pocket. There was a folded pharmacy receipt there. On the back, in sharp blue ink, was a number and 4 words. "Do not sign on Sunday." 3 days later Adam came smiling up my front path with the same blue tin in a gift basket, a banker in a camel coat behind him, and a folder that would have shifted control of $11.8 million into a private holding company before the coffee had time to cool. I smiled back. I thanked him. I let them sit at my dead wife's table. And that night I rubbed the balm into Miriam's old silver jam spoon and left it on the kitchen sill above the sink. By dawn the spoon had gone black at the bowl, black and oily at the edges, and the kitchen smelled like bitter pennies. Some details in what follows have been shaped to carry the emotional truth cleanly, but the spine of it is exactly what it needs to be. I am going to tell you how I found out the man I raised had been helping his wife dose me in my own kitchen, how a riverfront conservancy became the center of a private land grab, and why the people who thought they would leave my memorial luncheon holding the keys to Miriam's legacy ended that same afternoon in handcuffs while the entire town watched. My name is Martin Hanley. I live in Port Canaan, Connecticut, where the river widens before it meets the sound and the gulls scream like they own every roof in town. I built machinery most of my life, repaired old lines, aligned turbines, corrected vibration nobody else could hear yet, and learned one lesson better than most. Damage almost never starts with the break. It starts with a sound so small people talk over it. By the time this story ends, you will understand the sound I missed. Most mornings, before any of this, I could have told you the exact minute the light changed over the east wall of the glasshouse. That is what retirement had become for me after Miriam died. Not leisure. Not hobbies. Not some clean bright Second Life magazine articles are always promising men my age as if a widowhood can be arranged into a better calendar. It became attention. The river at 6:10. The first gull at 6:23. The groan the back gate made in damp weather. The greenhouse pipe settling after the boiler shut off. The orchard rose in wind. The little rituals that let a man keep standing inside a house built for two when only one person is left using it. Miriam had been gone for 19 months when the woman at Bennett Hardware stopped me. 19 months is long enough for other people to stop looking at you with alarm. It is not long enough for the chair across from you at breakfast to stop being occupied in your body. She had run the conservancy with the kind of competence that makes everyone around you slightly lazier because they assume you will keep seeing what they miss. The property had started as 6 acres, one collapsing glasshouse from the 1890s, and a riverside boathouse nobody in town wanted to insure. We bought it when Adam was 11, because Miriam saw Broken Beauty as a thing worth investing in and I was too in love with her to put up much of an argument. We restored it over 12 years. I rebuilt the iron drive assemblies in the greenhouse vents. She turned the interior into a community growing space, school program, orchard walk, and summer market that people from 2 towns over now claimed had always belonged to them. That is how you know you built something worth having. People who ignored it at the start begin speaking about it later as if it appeared fully deserved. After the developers started circling the shoreline, the valuations changed. One luxury marina proposal. One boutique hotel proposal. One private equity group from New York that sent a man in soft loafers to tell Miriam he could preserve the spirit of the place while converting the riverfront acreage into residences with heritage continuity. Miriam smiled at him all through lunch and then rewrote the trust that same week. It only takes one hungry person with family access, she told me at the back rail one October evening, her hand flat on the cedar post, the river going copper in the sun. A stranger has to break in. Family only has to be welcomed. At the time I thought she was talking about abstract future greed. Estate planning in the general sense. The kind of ugly possibility responsible people address because they know human beings are weak around property. I did not think she meant Adam. That is the first confession I need to make cleanly. I did not see him that way. I had changed his diapers. I had taught him how to sand cedar, how to hold a level, how to back a trailer down a launch ramp without jackknifing it into public humiliation. When my sister Elaine died and his father drank himself into something too useless to raise a child, Adam came to us at 10 with 2 trash bags, 3 school shirts, and a stare too old for his face. He stayed. We never had children of our own. Not because we did not want them. Because life moved the way it moved and then the wanting turned into a different sort of life. Adam became our almost son, our legal nephew, our emotional center more years than either of us said aloud. Miriam packed his lunches. I built him a workbench lower than mine so he could stand beside me in the boathouse and feel essential. We did not adopt him formally because by the time we talked about it, he was nearly grown and angry at paperwork and loyalty at the same time. But he was ours in every way that mattered until I learned some ways matter more than others. He grew into a handsome, capable man with quick hands and a quicker smile than mine. He worked in commercial leasing for a while, then property brokerage, then what I gathered was a series of ventures with bigger promises than steady roots. Nothing criminal. Nothing openly rotten. Just a young man always half a rung above solid ground, telling himself the next move would be the move that justified the last 3. When he married Elise Farrow, I tried hard to like her. That sentence is fairer than the one that usually comes after betrayal, which is I knew from the start. I did not know. I distrusted, then corrected myself, then distrusted again. Elise had one of those polished, exact faces that always seems to be waiting for better lighting. She moved beautifully. She remembered names. She sent thank you notes. She complimented old houses without asking the price directly and still somehow left each room knowing the price. She ran something she called a transitional wellness consultancy for aging homeowners. She helped families prepare older relatives for safer living arrangements, simplified routines, dietary support, medication systems, and financial paperwork alignment. That was how she described it. There was nothing in that description a decent person could object to without sounding suspicious of caregiving itself. Miriam objected anyway. Not loudly. Not in declarations. Miriam had better manners than declarations. She objected in narrower ways. She watched Elise too long when Elise talked about friction points in older adults. She asked follow-up questions that sounded casual and ended with Elise slightly tighter around the mouth. She once told me, after Elise had gone home with Adam, that woman never looks at a room until she has already calculated exit, leverage, and resale. I laughed. That is confession number 2. I laughed. There is no cruelty as clean as hindsight when it finds you older and slower and still alive enough to understand the bill. The first year after Miriam died, Adam and Elise were attentive in ways that would have looked saintly from the outside. That is how certain kinds of harm begin. Not with cruelty so obvious it raises a hand in public. With competence. With casseroles and duplicate keys and a tone that says let us take some things off your plate before anyone asks who put them there. Elise learned my kitchen quickly. She knew where the decent knives were by her second visit. She knew the good olive oil, the bad coffee, the drawer where Miriam kept the twine and produced rubber bands and seed packets folded around little handwritten labels. She arrived with jars of soup and hot bread and a kind of graceful efficiency that made ordinary loneliness feel briefly embarrassed for itself. She asked about my sleep. My appetite. The ache in my right hand in damp weather. She said all the right things about grief moving through the body before it moves through the mind. I let her say them. Some part of me knew I was being managed before I admitted the word. I could feel it in the way she spaced questions. Never too many in a row. Never enough to sound clinical. The pattern of a person who had learned exactly how much concern a proud older man will accept before he hears supervision instead of love. Adam watched more than he spoke in those months. That also should have warned me. He had never been a silent man with us. As a boy he narrated everything. As a young man he argued with his whole face. After Miriam died he became careful around me, and I read it as tenderness. What I should have read was conflict. A man avoiding his own eyes in the presence of someone who trusts him is not always shy. Sometimes he is petitioning. The first thing Elise brought regularly was sleep tea. Then mineral drops. Then protein shakes she said would help me stop skipping lunch. Then a cedar balm in a round blue tin that she said an osteopath recommended for inflammation in men who have done physical work past 60. Rub it into the inside of the wrist and the heel of the hand. Let the warmth carry it. That was how she described it. Warmth carry it. The balm smelled expensive. Cedar, clove, something medicinal underneath, and a sweetness that arrived late. She rubbed it into my hand the first time before I could decide whether I wanted help. Not a sensual gesture. Not exactly. Worse than that. A confident one. A person accustomed to older bodies complying when she took hold of them. I slept hard that night. Not well. Hard. There is a difference. Good sleep returns you to yourself. This sleep dropped over me like wet canvas. Heavy. Complete. I woke with the impression that time had moved without consulting me. I told myself grief does that. So does age. So does winter. So does being a man suddenly eating regular meals again after 18 months of coffee and bad toast. That is how explanations pile up when the truth is still too rude to invite in. Over the next several weeks the pattern thickened. Elise began arriving on the same mornings my neighbor Ruth Templeton was usually out deadheading the winter boxes or dragging her garbage bin to the curb. Ruth saw the soup containers. Saw the juice bottles. Saw Elise steady me by the elbow on the icy steps. Ruth later told Detective Lena Ortiz that if she had been asked then, she would have described Elise as a godsend. That is the terrible thing about good staging. It does not need many witnesses. It only needs ordinary ones. Elise asked Ruth twice, almost idly, whether I had seemed more forgetful since Miriam's passing. Not forgetful as in did I leave the gate open. Forgetful as in had she noticed me telling the same story twice. That distinction matters. The first time Ruth said no and thought nothing of it. The second time she said something about me seeming tired lately. That one sentence would later get quoted back to me in a typed capacity summary produced by a doctor I had never chosen. The doctor came into the story exactly the way people with bad intentions prefer professionals to arrive. Already connected. Already suggested. Already framed as relief. Dr. Kellen Voss practiced geriatric medicine from a clean little office near the marina where the windows always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and hand sanitizer. Elise scheduled the appointment before I agreed to it. Told me she just wanted baseline numbers. Nothing dramatic. A little memory screening never hurts after a major bereavement. That was how she said it. Never hurts. Dr. Voss was the sort of man who wears soft expensive glasses and speaks like every sentence has been checked for liability before it reaches air. He asked me to remember 3 words, subtract 7 several times, draw a clock face, tell him what day of the week it was. I did all of it well enough, I thought. Better than many men my age would do under fluorescent lighting with a stranger timing them. But he wrote for a long time after each answer, and his silence had the quality of a person documenting around you rather than with you. When I mentioned the sleep tea and the supplements and the cedar balm, his pen did not stop moving. At the end he said nothing alarming. Mild bereavement fatigue. Elevated blood pressure. Monitor hydration. Minimize strain. Perhaps allow family more logistical support over the next quarter. The next quarter. Odd phrase. Not next few weeks. Not until spring. The next quarter. The language of someone already thinking in administrative windows. I drove home that afternoon with Miriam's scarf folded on the passenger seat and told myself I was imagining the sharp edges because I missed her. A widower can mistake almost anything for threat once enough of the house belongs to memory. What I did not know was that Elise sat in her car after that appointment and sent Adam a text that read, first note in the file. Keep him tired. Detective Ortiz would show me that message later. At the time all I knew was that I had begun waking with a metallic taste under my tongue and a softness around late afternoon that felt less like sleepiness and more like my thoughts had been wrapped in wool. I forgot I had already salted the greenhouse walk one morning and salted it again. I made eggs twice and did not remember eating the first 2 until I found the skillet cooling on the stove. Once I stood in the boathouse holding the wrong wrench and could not recall why I had chosen it. Those moments were brief. That is important. If they had come longer or harsher I might have fought sooner. But the most effective erosion is the kind that leaves you just functional enough to keep doubting yourself. The woman at Bennett Hardware did not feel like the start of a story that day. She felt like static. I knew her face the way you know a face you have seen at funerals, fundraisers, and church basements over enough years that the exact first encounter dissolves. Narrow shoulders. Upright posture despite age. Hair pinned back without softness. The sort of woman whose coat always looks brushed and whose grocery list has probably never once been written on a napkin. What unsettled me was not just that she knew about the blue tin. It was that she spoke about Sunday as if the schedule had already been drafted and merely awaited my body. That Sunday Adam and Elise came at 12:15 with mushroom soup, rye bread, the blue tin tied in ribbon, and Elliot Cranesby from Fairmarsh Private Trust in a camel coat carrying a folder too thick to be routine. Elliot was one of those men banks send when they want something to look like prudence rather than appetite. 50-something. Hair the color of wet sand. Good posture. The sort of voice that can make theft sound like risk management if given a clear room and a grieving target. He told me the conservancy had reached a critical stewardship point. Those were his exact words. Because of escalating maintenance costs, donor fatigue, my age, and the need for continuity, Fairmarsh recommended converting the trust structure into a professionally managed heritage vehicle. The vehicle in question was a limited holding company called River Lantern Heritage Partners. Adam would sit on the board. Elliot would oversee transition. I would retain honorary founder status and lifetime residential use of the main house. Nothing rash. Nothing disruptive. Purely prudent stewardship. I sat there with the soup cooling in front of me and felt Miriam's absence more sharply than I had in months. Honorary founder status. That is how men like Elliot describe removing the living owner from his own table while pretending to keep the chair. Elise kept the performance soft. She did not lead the legal talk. She replenished bread. Touched my shoulder once. Asked whether the room was too warm. Set the blue tin beside my water glass and said, "Use a little before we go through the last pages. Your hand's bothering you." Adam did not look at me when she said it. He looked at the folder. There are silences men hear differently than women do after enough years working around machinery. The silence before a turbine catches. The silence before a chain slips. The silence in a room where one person is waiting for another person to comply with something already agreed elsewhere. That was the silence in my dining room. I smiled the way older men learn to smile when they do not intend to give a clean no until they know what the no is for. "Elliot," I said, "I don't sign anything after lunch." That made him blink. Not because it was a strong legal objection. Because it was ridiculous enough to require him to reevaluate what kind of resistance I might offer. "I beg your pardon. I don't sign paperwork after lunch. Never have. Mornings or not at all. Occupational superstition." Adam almost laughed. It died halfway up his throat. Elise recovered first. "Then we can come back tomorrow," she said lightly. "No rush." People who truly have no rush do not say no rush in that tone. Elliot pivoted into reassurance. Nothing needed immediately. These were first review copies. We could discuss again at the trustees' memorial luncheon on Sunday, when the donor committee would already be on site for the spring. Conservancy preview. That was the first time anyone called it a memorial luncheon to my face. Not Miriam's memorial. The trustees' memorial luncheon. A phrase so bloodless it sounded pre-catered. By then I had already decided about the tin. Not what it meant. Not who had built the thing inside it. Only that I would not let it touch my skin. After they left, I stood in the kitchen holding the blue tin and looking at Miriam's old silver jam spoon in the utensil crock by the sink. The spoon mattered because Miriam's grandmother had given it to us when we bought the property. "For the first good fruit you grow yourselves," she said. The bowl was shallow, the handle chased with tiny leaves. Miriam used it every August when the orchard pears came in. I opened the tin. The balm had a pale amber surface with the faint shine of something that should not have gleamed under kitchen light. I scooped a thumb worth and rubbed it into the silver bowl of the spoon, not hard, just enough to coat it. Then I set the spoon on the sill above the sink where late light from the river would hit it first thing at dawn. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was brave. Because fear had sharpened into waiting, and waiting is a rougher thing than fear when the object is already inside your house. At 4:32, according to the microwave clock, I gave up on bed and went downstairs. The kitchen was gray with first light. The house still held that pre-bird stillness where every pipe and board sounds louder than it does by day. I went to the window and looked at the spoon. At first I thought the dawn light was tricking the color. Then I lifted it. The bowl had darkened to an oily charcoal black, black enough that it streaked my finger when I touched the edge with a dish towel. Not tarnish. Not age. A reaction. At the center sat a faint iridescent ring like burnished gasoline on water. I remember smelling my own kitchen before I understood what I was looking at. The sharp mineral smell. The little bite at the back of the nose. Metal and bitterness. I set the spoon down very carefully on a plate. Then I opened every drawer in the house as if danger might become easier to categorize if I kept moving. At the back of the third drawer beside the stove I found a gallon freezer bag. Into it went the spoon, the tin, and the paper ribbon tied around it. I sealed the top twice with both thumbs and put the bag in the refrigerator behind the butter dish where Elise had never once reached in all her attentive little visits. She handled the front of my refrigerator like it was part of the act. She never touched the deep back shelf where I kept old jars nobody else would think worth moving. At 7:10 the phone rang. Adam. I watched it ring 4 times before picking up. Morning, Uncle Marty, he said, too casual. Just checking whether Elliot overwhelmed you yesterday. Uncle Marty. He only called me that when he wanted to sound younger than his conscience. I slept on it, I said. That was true. Good, he said. Elise was thinking maybe we could do a little wellness reset this week before Sunday. Light meals. Less strain. Maybe let Dr. Voss stop by for a short cognitive follow-up. Just so everyone feels protected. Protected. There is a moment in some conversations when the person on the other end tells you what the whole arrangement has actually been for, not by confessing, but by reaching too early for the result. This was that moment. Why would everyone need to feel protected from me? I asked. Silence. Then, too fast, that's not what I meant. Of course it was what he meant. I said I had to go. I hung up. Then I stood at Miriam's sink with the blackened spoon in the refrigerator and the number from the hardware store receipt in my pocket and understood I had reached the place decent men dread most. The place where love stops being an explanation and starts becoming evidence against your own judgment. I called the number at 7:23. A woman answered on the second ring and said, "You tested it." Not hello. Not who is this. You. Tested it. Who am I speaking to? June Bell. Miriam would be furious I waited this long to tell you my name, but she would be angrier if I had warned you badly. The name landed half familiar and then opened. June from the Historical Society archive room. June who always wore sturdy skirts and kept lavender mints in her bag. June who once spent 3 hours in our glasshouse cataloging donated seed ledgers with Miriam and came to dinner afterward and argued with her about whether public memory belonged in locked drawers or open shelves. Not a close family friend in the way some people are knitted into your week. But a woman Miriam trusted enough to leave alone with documents that mattered. How do you know about the tin? I asked. Because Elise Farrow ordered the compound 3 weeks ago from a specialty pharmacy on Water Street, and because she was foolish enough to say your name out loud in front of a woman old enough to be ignored. My grip tightened on the phone. June, what compound? You need a doctor before you need my story. Go to Celeste Morgan at River County Internal Medicine. Not Voss. Not anyone Elise recommends. Tell Dr. Morgan I sent you. Tell her it was the blue cedar tin, and take the spoon. That should have sounded absurd. Instead it sounded like instruction. Clean. Specific. The kind that borrows authority from accuracy. I'll explain the rest when you know what it is, June said. And Martin, do not confront them until you've spoken to the police. The fact that police came before question in her sequence told me everything about the seriousness, even if I still did not know the mechanics. Dr. Celeste Morgan fit June's description exactly. Mid-50s. Dark hair cut shorter than vanity. No decorative language in the office. No potted peace lilies trying to soften medicine. Just clean surfaces, deliberate eyes, and a voice that did not waste steps getting to what mattered. When I put the freezer bag on her desk and told the story from the first visit of the cedar balm to the hardware store warning to the black spoon, she did not smile politely. She did not slow me down to the pace of someone humoring an old man at the edge of grief. She picked up the phone before I had finished. That is one of those details that stays with you. A doctor who picks up the phone before she reaches for reassurance has already decided the danger is real. By noon my blood had been drawn. The spoon and balm were on their way to a county toxicology lab, and Dr. Morgan had explained what she suspected in language so calm it made the terror land harder, not softer. Not a single clean poison intended to kill me in one spectacular evening. A compounded transdermal mixture. Low-dose anticholinergic agents. Sedative support. Trace heavy metal carrier. Something built not to drop an old man at his table, but to blur him, dry him out, slow his memory, roughen his handwriting, elevate his blood pressure, and make the next concerned voice in the room sound reasonable. Reasonable to who? I asked. To a court, she said. We did not say anything for a moment after that. There it was. Not a murder made to look like nature. A cognitive decline made to look like age. A body softened into paperwork. Dr. Morgan gave me water, then called someone from the county prosecutor's investigative division while I sat in the exam chair trying not to picture all the times Elise had taken my wrist as if she had every right to it. Detective Lena Ortiz came into the story wearing a navy blazer over a plain sweater and carrying no visible need to impress anybody. Mid-40s. Dark eyes. The sort of stillness people mistake for softness until they realize it is actually control with all the vanity removed. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "Can you go home and act exactly as though nothing in your understanding has changed?" I said yes before I knew whether it was true. Sometimes the body answers because pride is quicker than honesty. Ortiz nodded once as if she had expected that answer and was now testing whether I could survive it. Good. Because if they're building toward incapacity or a trust transfer, the next 48 hours matter more than anything you've felt so far. She laid it out in a line. Do not refuse visits abruptly. Do not mention the lab. Do not touch anything they bring without preserving it. Do not sign anything. Do not meet Dr. Voss alone if it can be avoided. If Adam calls, speak to him as you always have. If Elise arrives, let her see what she expects to see. They will press harder if they suspect delay. There is a kind of work older men do poorly, and it is called pretending to need help from the people now suspected of manufacturing the need. That was my work for the rest of the week. On Tuesday Elise brought pear juice in a swing-top bottle and stood at my sink asking whether I had made it to the pharmacy for a refill of the cedar balm. A refill. As if she expected regular use now. As if the dose schedule had already entered phase 2. I smiled, poured half the juice into a glass in front of her, drank enough to be seen doing it, and excused myself to the downstairs bathroom where I poured the rest into the toilet and flushed twice. At lunch Adam texted, Dr. Voss says a short check-in tomorrow would reassure the board. The board. Until then I had not known there was a board involved beyond the named trustees in the conservancy filing. That one message told Ortiz something she had not yet had clean. They were already mobilizing governance language around me. Not in theory. In motion. By Wednesday afternoon the lab called Dr. Morgan with preliminary findings. The spoon had reacted to the bomb because silver and the carrier compounds do not love each other quietly. The mixture in the blue tin matched what Morgan suspected. Enough to impair, not enough to announce. Slow enough to let someone document the symptoms and call them organic. Detective Ortiz came to my house that evening and stood at Miriam's kitchen counter while the river went dark outside the windows. You understand this probably isn't about just making you sleepy, she said. I looked at the conservancy gate through the sink window. The iron arch. The sign with Miriam's name. The school bus turnoff on the far road. The lit greenhouse skeleton glowing amber in the dark. Yes, I said. It's about getting me to sign or getting someone else to sign over me. She nodded. And if that is the goal, there will be drafts. Email chains. Medical language. Maybe a petition. Maybe trust amendments. They're not improvising. I asked the question then that had been sitting in my throat since Morgan said the word court. Can you tell yet whether Adam understands the whole thing? Ortiz did not answer quickly. That told me enough before she spoke. I think, she said finally, that your nephew understands enough to participate and not enough to feel like the villain of his own story. That is a colder sentence than it seems. Most dangerous people do not walk through life thinking I am the villain now. They think, I am solving a problem that should have been solved by someone softer. I met June Bell the next morning in the archive room behind St. Bridget's Parish Hall. If you have never been inside an archive run by women who loved order before computers pretended to invent it, you may not understand the atmosphere. Cardboard acid-free boxes. Tables scrubbed almost colorless. White labels in careful hand. The smell of old paper, paste, dust, and dried flowers tucked into books decades ago and forgotten until someone who mattered died and left them there. June was waiting at the far table with 2 mugs of tea and a stack of linen-backed folders tied in cotton tape. She was smaller up close than my memory had made her. Not fragile. Concentrated. Age had narrowed her without weakening the core. "You look worse than I hoped and better than I feared," she said. That was our greeting. She untied the first folder while I sat there trying to reconcile the woman in the lighting aisle with the woman my wife apparently trusted more than I had known. "I am going to tell this in order," June said. "If I let your feelings lead, we will lose time to the wrong shock." That sentence alone told me why Miriam liked her. June and Miriam had run the Conservancy archives together every Wednesday for 27 years. Not the public tours. Not donor nights. The hidden work. Seed ledgers. Easement maps. Salvage records from the original glasshouse restoration. Correspondence. Drafts of the trust. The conversations no one else hears when a life is being built slowly enough that each page matters. I did not know about Wednesdays. I want that noted plainly. I had been married to Miriam for 41 years, and she had a 27-year weekly life with another woman that I knew only in outlines. Not because she deceived me. Because not every room in a marriage is meant to be shared. Some are foundations, not parlors. June showed me the first thing Miriam left with her. A sealed note in Miriam's handwriting dated 9 months before she died. "If Martin is ever made to doubt his own mind, help him before he apologizes for it." I read that line 3 times. Not if Martin declines quickly. Not if Martin becomes confused. Made to doubt his own mind. Miriam had not feared age in the abstract. She had feared manipulation specifically enough to name the shape without naming the actors. What did she know? I asked. June folded her hands over the note. Not enough to accuse. More than enough to prepare. Miriam had noticed the same things I laughed off. The way Elise studied rooms by exits, controls, and implied value. The way Adam became just slightly more eager each time a developer called. The way land worth changed the moral temperature of family conversations. One autumn, after Adam and Elise toured the whole conservancy with a private investor under the excuse of discussing a donor partnership, Miriam rewrote the trust with attorney Nora Bellamy and added what June called the integrity provision. That phrase turned out to matter more than any lab result in the long run. The integrity provision stated that if any trustee, beneficiary, family affiliate, or successor entity attempted to obtain control of the conservancy through concealed financial interest, capacity manipulation, coercive transfer, or related self-dealing, that attempt would automatically void their beneficial standing and transfer all decision rights to the Public Stewardship Board and the Hanley Scholarship Endowment. In plain English, Miriam built a trap. If someone in the family tried to take the land by abusing an old man's mind, they did not merely fail. They lost every possible future claim to it. She made it that hard because she thought of Adam? I asked. June gave me a look so level it felt like a hand laid against my chest. She made it that hard because she loved Adam and still knew he was weak where admiration and money meet. There is a difference between being told the person you raised is evil and being told he is weak enough to be useful to evil. One lets you hate cleanly. The other leaves you standing in mud. June told me how she found out about the blue tin. 3 weeks earlier she had gone to Water Street Specialty Pharmacy to pick up a compounded eye ointment. Elise stood at the side counter with Dr. Voss's assistant. The assistant was reviewing directions too quietly for anyone outside their little polished circle to hear clearly, but Elise was careless where people her age often are careless around the old. She assumed invisibility moved one direction. June heard my name. Then conservancy. Then Sunday window. Then, if the topical keeps the tremor and dry mouth consistent another 10 days, boss can justify the review language. June had left the pharmacy, sat in her car, and read Miriam's note again before deciding what to do. She called Nora Bellamy first. Nora confirmed the provision, confirmed that any self-dealing move would trigger it if documented well enough, and confirmed something else that made my stomach fold in on itself. Someone from Fairmarsh Private Trust had already requested copies of the conservancy governance instruments 2 months earlier under the excuse of reviewing donor risk. Elliot Cranesby had not walked into my dining room with a brand new idea. He had been circling. "Why didn't you come sooner?" I asked, and I regretted it immediately because the question held accusation I had no right to aim at the woman who had just saved me. June heard the tone anyway. She had the grace not to punish me for it. Because I needed to know whether they were maneuvering around the trust or around you. Those are different wars, Martin. One is civil. The other is criminal. She paused, then added, and because I was afraid I would frighten you into warning them by mistake. That was fair. Too fair. Then she opened the second folder. Inside were copies Nora Bellamy had prepared the year Miriam amended the trust. Board structure. Trigger conditions. Emergency authority. There in black text sat the part that would later become the sweetest blade I have ever seen in a legal document. Any declared self-dealing act, attempted transfer, shell entity conversion, or incapacity-based reassignment made for private benefit would not only collapse the claim. It would permanently convert the family's contingent memorial privileges into public scholarships administered in Miriam's name. No house rights. No board seat. No future land share. No private carve-out. If Adam and Elise made their move and we proved the move, the conservancy would become farther from their hands than it had ever been before they reached for it. Miriam had built the trap because she understood something I only learned when I nearly died. Love does not protect property from greed. It merely gives greed a cleaner map. Once I knew the trust could bite back, the investigation stopped feeling like pure defense and started feeling like timing. That distinction matters. Defense keeps you alive. Timing lets you choose where the people who meant you harm will be standing when the floor gives way. Detective Ortiz brought in 2 more people by Friday. Assistant State's Attorney Naomi Rees, who had the dry concentrated manner of a woman who had long ago stopped mistaking emotion for evidence, and a forensic accountant named Paul Ivers, who looked as though he had been born disappointed in other people's bookkeeping and had decided to make a profession out of proving why. We met in the back office of River County Internal Medicine after hours because the clinic had security and nobody from Fairmarsh expected to find me there again so soon. Paul spread out a chronology of donor inquiries, property valuations, and shell registrations across Dr. Morgan's little conference table and started drawing lines between dates the way I used to align shafts before locking a housing back into place. One measure at a time. No drama. No flourish. Just the satisfaction of things deciding to admit what shape they had always been. River Lantern Heritage Partners had been formed 6 weeks before my first appointment with Dr. Voss. Not after. Before. Adam's name sat on the paperwork as minority managing member. Elisa's brother, Owen Farrow, held another slice through a property consulting arm. The majority interest belonged to a financing vehicle whose address traced back to Fairmarsh Private Trust's Lower Manhattan affiliate office. The developer waiting in the wings was called East Quay Development. They had already deposited an option retainer into an escrow account contingent on stewardship conversion. Stewardship conversion. That was the phrase hiding under everything. Not murder. Not fraud. Stewardship conversion. A whole private plan disguised in the language of continuity. Paul found one transfer that made Naomi Rees stop writing and look up sharply. Adam had received a consulting advance from River Lantern 4 days after Dr. Voss's first memory screen, the exact amount being enough to pay off the short note on the condo Adam and Elise had bought last year near Stamford. Their debts were not theoretical. They had a timeline and an amount. That gave weakness a price tag. Ortiz looked at me and said, "If we move too early, they'll say this was a lawful transition you misunderstood under grief and medicine. If we move late enough, they will say more than that in their own words." So the weekend became performance. On Saturday Elise arrived with clear broth and 2 small brown bottles from a wellness apothecary. She stood in my kitchen under Miriam's hanging copper pans and said, "You look tired, Martin." That was new. Not Uncle Marty through Adam. Not Mr. Hanley-like donors. Martin. An intimacy sharpened into control. I let my shoulders drop a little. Let my hand rest longer on the counter before turning. Let her see what she wanted to believe the compounds had been building toward. "You know how it is," I said. She smiled. "I actually do." That was when I understood the exact vanity at the center of her. Not greed first. Mastery first. She liked being the person who knew what a body would do next if managed correctly. Adam came later with printed donor materials for the trustees' memorial luncheon. He did not stay long. But while he stood in the pantry doorway talking about parking logistics, his eyes went to my wrist twice. By then Ortiz had already asked me to stop thinking like prey and start thinking like a technician. Where do they look first? What do they assume is under control? What change in routine are they measuring? Adam was not checking whether I seemed generally frail. He was checking whether the blue tin had been used. If you are still with me in the middle of this story, take 1 small second to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from, your city or your country. I read more of those comments than people think. And if you have ever watched someone use concern as a leash, leave the word concern too. People think the ugly part of betrayal is always the shouting. It isn't. Sometimes it is the soft voice asking whether you remembered your medicine while it decides what to take from you next. By Sunday morning Naomi Rees had what she needed to move toward warrants, but not yet what she wanted for the cleanest case. We had toxicology. We had financial pre-structuring. We had Voss's suggestive language and Elisa's pharmacy trail. What we did not have yet was the live bridge between the chemical management and the land grab in their own mouths. So we built for it. The trustees' memorial luncheon had been in planning for weeks. Miriam's spring opening. Donor tables under the East Greenhouse span. A memorial scholarship announcement. Press from the local paper and the regional Shoreline magazine because East Quay had already seeded whispers about a visionary next phase for the property. Elise and Elliot believed Sunday would give them a room full of legitimacy. My shaky hand. Their paperwork. Donors as soft witnesses. A grieving founder endorsing transition before anybody had time to smell motive. What they did not know was that Nora Bellamy would also be in that room with a certified copy of the original trust and the integrity provision, that Detective Ortiz's team would be in plain clothes among the guests, and that the microphones clipped under my lapel and beneath the greenhouse podium had been tested twice the night before by a county tech named Samuel Pike who spoke to electronics the way clergymen speak to relics. We still needed something else. We needed Adam and Elise to tell the truth badly enough that the lie could not be reconstructed around it later. That chance came sooner than expected. At 4:30 Sunday afternoon, while the greenhouse volunteers were still laying linen runners over the donor tables, Elise found me alone in the west potting room among sacks of soil and terracotta trays. She closed the door partway behind her. Not enough to be dramatic. Enough to create a private corridor in sound. "You need to take the balm before tomorrow," she said. No warm lead-in. No soft concern. No theater because she thought the theater was already no longer necessary. I sat on the work stool and looked at her. Why? She blinked once, almost. Annoyed that I had asked for a reason instead of receiving a direction. Because your hand tremor has to remain consistent. There it was. Not your pain. Not your comfort. Your tremor. Has to. For the review. What review? The board review, Martin. She exhaled through her nose. Please do not make me say everything plainly when it is so much easier for everyone if you keep trusting us. Everyone. Such a generous word for people arranging to erase someone. I let silence do what Naomi had said silence often does. Force the controlling person to fill it with their own impatience. Elise stepped closer. This does not have to be ugly, she said. You keep the house. Adam keeps the burden. The donors keep feeling good about Miriam. You get to rest. The property survives. It is honestly the best version still available. I looked at her hands. Beautiful hands. Neutral nails. No ring except the narrow gold wedding band. Hands that had held soup bowls and touched my wrist and turned care into a delivery system. And if I say no? Her face changed then. Not much. Enough. You already said yes when you kept letting us help. That sentence is the cleanest definition of coercive care I have ever heard. The help itself becomes the argument for surrender. I asked one more question because Samuel Pike had told me the hidden Mike loved still voices and clear phrasing. Was any of this ever about my health? Elise answered too fast. It was about preventing a mess. There. Not health. Mess. Which was to say me. I told Ortiz about the potting room conversation an hour later while we stood behind the east greenhouse boiler enclosure pretending to inspect a leak. She did not smile. She did not congratulate me. She just said, good. That helps. Not enough yet. That is one of the reasons I trusted her. She never mistook progress for completion. At 7:12 that evening Adam called and asked whether he could stop by for 10 minutes. Alone. Just to make sure tomorrow ran smoothly. I said yes. He came at 7:40 with rain on his shoulders and that old boyish forward lean in his walk that still had the power to blind me if I let it. No Elise. No Elliot. Just Adam and a cardboard pastry box from the bakery on Main, as if showing up with almond twists could still drag us back into simpler versions of ourselves. We sat in the boathouse because I could not bear the kitchen with him just then. The boathouse smelled the way it always smelled in wet weather, rope, old varnish, river damp, cedar dust from the skiff rack I meant to repair 3 summers ago and never had. He put the pastry box on the workbench and did not open it. I don't want tomorrow to get weird, he said. The sentence almost made me laugh. Weird. Not criminal. Not irreversible. Weird. What exactly do you think tomorrow is? I asked. He rubbed his palms on his jeans and looked at the outboard motor hanging against the far wall, anywhere but at me. It is a transition. From what? From you carrying too much. That was the line he had been given. I could hear the practiced compromise in it. Enough care to soothe his conscience. Enough vagueness to avoid confession. I said nothing. Adam looked at me then, just once, and in that one look I saw the little boy with the split lip from the schoolyard fight and the grown man with debt under his collar and someone else's ambition stitched into his language. It doesn't have to change much, he said. You stay here. I manage the donor side. East Quay stabilizes the maintenance. Nobody takes anything from you. East Quay. He should not have said the name out loud before the papers were signed. That was the mistake grief-free men make. They speak from the future too soon. How much did they promise you? I asked. He went still. I had not raised my voice. That matters. Men like Adam had spent enough years around anger to survive it. Stillness frightened him more because it left him alone with his own reply. That isn't fair. I did not ask whether it was fair. Uncle Marty. How much? He looked away again. That was answer. Enough, but he gave me the number anyway in the end because some men cannot stop themselves from hoping truth, once told, will somehow excuse the road taken to it. 240,000 over 3 years, he said. I nodded once. Even. Measured. There are numbers that reveal the whole moral size of a person faster than speeches ever could. He had spent my blood pressure, my memory, my dead wife's work, and my living trust for $80,000 a year. That is not a grand tragedy. That is a cheap sell. I said no at first, he added quickly, and the speed of it made clear he had been waiting to say this. I need you to know that. I said no. How many times? He swallowed. Twice. And the third. He shut his eyes. Just for a second. She said it wasn't stealing if you still lived here. There it was. The private logic. The manageable theft. Leave the old man the porch and call the rest continuity. Did you know about the bomb? Silence. He did not say yes. He did not need to. He gave me the softer answer weak men love because it sounds adjacent to innocence while standing nowhere near it. I knew she had a system. A system. I thought then of all the jars and teas and little bottles lined up on my counter over the last month like kindness in civilian clothes. What did you think the system did? Just made you calmer. He said it so quietly I nearly missed it. Quieter than a lie usually is. More like the confession of a man who had rehearsed a milder world until he could almost live in it. Did you ask? He shook his head. Why not? He laughed once, thin and ugly. Because every time I asked, I had to hear what was really underneath everything. My debt. The conservancy. East Quay. Voss. The board. I kept thinking if I only knew my part, I could still tell myself it wasn't all the way rotten. That, if I am honest, was the first sentence from him that felt entirely true. Not enough to save him. Enough to make the damage more human and therefore harder. I asked the last question Naomi told me to ask if the opening came. Was there ever a version where you meant to tell me before it was done? He looked at the river through the cracked boathouse window and said, I told myself I would after the first signing. After the first signing. Meaning there was more than one. Later I would learn the plan in full. Monday, capacity affirmation. Wednesday, governance conversion. 30 days later, option exercise with East Quay. By summer, public announcement. By autumn, demolition permits for the old boathouse and South Orchard Edge. All of it had a calendar. At the time all I knew was that my almost son had just admitted he meant to confess after the paperwork made confession useless. When he left, he did something worse than crying. He reached out and touched the old workbench like the place might plead for him if he made contact first. Then he said, I hope one day you understand I did love you. I answered with the only sentence I had. You are going to learn that love without resistance is just appetite with family language wrapped around it. He left in the rain. The mic on my shirt had taken all of it. By 9:30, Detective Ortiz had the live recording, Elisa's potting room statement, Adam's payment admission, and enough connective tissue to move from suspicion to structure. But she still waited. Because Naomi Rees wanted the Sunday room. The donors. The banker. The doctor. The public claim of stewardship. The self-dealing act in motion. Not merely planned. In motion. That night I slept in Miriam's chair in the library with the lamp on and the conservancy easement maps open on the rug at my feet, and I dreamed of nothing at all, which was a mercy. At 5:40 the next morning I woke to rain tapping the greenhouse panes and remembered where the day ended. Not at a luncheon. At a trap my wife had designed years before the people stepping into it even knew they would need one. The trustees' memorial luncheon began at noon under the east span of the glasshouse, the part with the highest ceiling in the Oldest iron ribs, where sunlight usually fell in long pale bars across the citrus tables and the donor plaques. On that Monday it rained until 10, then cleared hard and bright as if the weather itself wanted the room visible. People arrived dressed for reverence and networking in equal measure. The older volunteers wore dark blue and forest green and carried grief with the practiced public faces of people who have attended enough memorials to know how much of themselves to show. The donors wore the coastal version of philanthropy, loafers soft enough to cost money, scarves too light for the season, careful statements about stewardship and Miriam's vision. The local paper sent a photographer. The Shoreline magazine sent a woman in camel wool who called the conservancy ripe for adaptive legacy use, before she realized I was standing close enough to hear. Elliot Cranesby moved through the room like a maitre d' of deferred ownership. Dr. Voss stood by the lemon trees with a quiet donor couple and spoke with the moderated gravity of a man already inside the next stage of his story. Elise handled tables, flowers, volunteer questions, menu adjustments, the microphone stand, and my pulse all with the same light competent hand. Adam spent too long near the entrance pretending to coordinate parking and very little time looking at me. That alone told me he still had enough conscience left to find my face dangerous. I dressed carefully. That detail may sound vain given everything else in motion, but dignity matters when people have been arranging you in advance as diminished. Navy suit. White shirt. The silver cuff links Miriam gave me our first year as official co-directors of the conservancy. No wristwatch. Never again from anyone but me. Naomi had insisted I keep my opening remarks exactly as drafted until the pivot. Samuel Pike taped the wire beneath my lapel and said, "Try not to pat yourself like a man hiding a pigeon." I told him I had handled more dignified equipment in union plants than he had likely touched in his life. He said he had no doubt and tightened the mic anyway. Nora Bellamy arrived with a hard case and the original certified trust in a waterproof sleeve. If you have never loved a careful lawyer, you may not understand how reassuring a waterproof sleeve can be. At 11:52 Elise took my elbow and guided me toward the front table in full view of donors, volunteers, and the little forest of stems and glass cylinders she had arranged down the center. "My brave man," she said softly enough that only the two of us could hear it. "Not my dear Martin. Not founder. Not family. My brave man." A phrase for invalids and patients and good dogs before a procedure. I looked at her hand on my sleeve and thought of the blackened spoon in the evidence bag at county toxicology. "Take your hand off me," I said pleasantly. She laughed as if I had made a small joke and did not fully obey. Not until Ruth Templeton, who had no formal reason to be there except that she had loved Miriam and distrusted polished women on principle, appeared at my other side and linked her arm through mine. That moment still pleases me. Ruth was in mauve silk and orthopedic shoes and had told Ortiz the week before, "If that little fox tries to walk him like a patient in public, I want to be there when he stops her." We took our seats. The meal began. Soup. Trout. Salad with winter pears. Bread so good I resented it for arriving on the wrong day. Elliot gave the first stewardship remarks. Miriam's vision. Evolving needs. Sustainable guardianship. Multi-generational continuity. Private-public partnership. Every phrase smelled like polished theft. Then Dr. Voss spoke about resilience after loss and the importance of letting older adults accept appropriate support before avoidable decline makes their choices for them. If you want to know how evil survives in respectable rooms, listen to the sentences people can build once they stop caring which human being those sentences are meant to erase. By the time they called me to the podium, the room had been softened properly. Grief, continuity, expertise, concern. They had built their emotional runway. I stood slowly. That part was not theater. I truly felt slower than I used to. Anger is not youth. Survival is not restored innocence. My body had been through enough in 6 weeks to earn the stiffness in it. But my voice when it reached the microphone belonged entirely to me. "Thank you for coming," I said. Some of you knew Miriam better than others. Some of you knew her through grants and school tours and summer fruit baskets and donor letters. A few of you knew the woman who could skin your argument cleanly in under 40 seconds if you tried to sell her private greed in public language. That got the first real sound from the room. Not laughter. Recognition. Good. I spoke for 7 minutes before the pivot, because Miriam deserved 7 minutes of truth before I turned her memorial into the courtroom they had built for themselves. I talked about the first broken pane we replaced with salvage glass from a condemned chapel. The winter we nearly lost the North Citrus Row because the old boiler seized on Christmas Eve. The fact that Miriam kept the first harvest ledger in pencil because ink felt too permanent for failure. The way schoolchildren from town still ran for the river door before they remembered not to run in the greenhouse at all. Then I stopped, put one hand flat on the podium, and said, "Yesterday my nephew asked me whether one day I would understand that he loved me." Across the room Adam went white so quickly I could see it from the microphone. That was when the audience first sensed the room had been booked under one purpose and would be used for another. No one moved. I continued. I have thought about that sentence all night. I think love is one of the easiest words in the language to counterfeit if everyone present has already decided to grade intention on a curve. You could feel the air change then. The donor stillness. The volunteer silence. The little electric interest of people realizing they are about to witness something nobody pre-cleared. Elise took one step toward the stage. Detective Ortiz, in a charcoal suit near table 4, shifted half an inch into her line of motion. That half inch was enough. So I told them about the blue tin. Not every detail. The exact right details. The bomb. The warning. The silver spoon. The toxicology report. The pharmacy trail. The memory screens. The governance company formed before anyone admitted governance needed changing. The consulting advance. The East Quay option. I did not raise my voice. That was Naomi's instruction and Miriam's style in combination. Rage makes good theater. Clarity makes good evidence. When I said River Lantern Heritage Partners out loud, Elliot Cranesby actually tried to stand up and interrupt. Ruth Templeton, blessed woman, put a hand on his sleeve and said, very audibly, "Sit down and be exposed like a gentleman." The room broke then. Not into chaos. Into truth. Gasps. A chair scraping. One volunteer crying quietly because she had loved Miriam and had never imagined the memorial lunch would end in this direction. The photographer from the local paper lowering his camera and then immediately raising it again because professional instinct won. Elise found her voice first. "This is disorientation," she said sharply. "Martin is confused and being manipulated." That line might have worked in a smaller room. In a bigger room, after a man has already named the shell company and the doctor and the banker and the option retainer correctly, it just sounds like bad timing. I looked at Nora Bellamy. She rose from table 3, carried the waterproof sleeve to the stage, removed the original trust, and opened it to the amended section Miriam drafted 9 months before she died. Nora read the integrity provision into the microphone in a voice like cold brass. Every word mattered. Concealed financial interest. Capacity manipulation. Coercive transfer. Automatic revocation. Permanent forfeiture. Scholarship endowment. By the time she finished, East Quay's entire future fantasy had converted, in the hearing of donors and town press and the public board, into a scholarship fund for Port Canaan trade students and shoreline apprentices. That was Miriam's revenge. Not mine. Mine came in what followed. Because Nora had not come alone. Naomi Rees stepped forward next and announced the state's office had authorized emergency orders freezing all transition activity, preserving the conservancy under its original public trust, and executing warrants already signed that morning for fraudulent medical reporting, conspiracy to commit coercive transfer, and attempted financial exploitation through chemically assisted incapacity. Then Detective Ortiz said, "Elise Farrow, Dr. Kellen Voss, Elliot Cranesby, do not leave this room. If you want a beautiful sound, listen once in your life to the silence that falls over a person when the role they prepared for collapses in public and the state speaks their real name instead. Elise did not scream first. That matters. Movies teach people to expect noise. Real trapped predators often start with insult. This is outrageous, she said, and the way she said outrageous told me what had injured her most was not the law, not the possibility of prison, but the embarrassment of being contradicted in a room she had dressed for victory. She turned toward Adam, not me. Say something. That also matters. The first instinct was not to defend innocence. It was to recover the script through the weaker party. Adam stayed seated. I still see that clearly. His hands flat on the tablecloth. Knuckles white. Pastry fork untouched beside his dessert plate. The face of a man who has just watched the future tense he built around his own betrayal collapse into the present. Elliot Cranesby did what men like Elliot always do when polished fraud stops being theoretical. He reached for procedure. This is a civil misunderstanding, he said. Any financial entity work product remains privileged pending review. Naomi Rees looked at him once and answered, your work product hit escrow before the principal was competent to approve the conversion structure you were documenting. Privilege does not cover conspiracy. If you have never watched a banker discover the room contains somebody who speaks his language more coldly than he does, I recommend it. Dr. Voss actually tried the noblest face. It is deeply irresponsible to turn a medically vulnerable man's grief into a spectacle. That one almost made me laugh. Not because it was ridiculous. Because it was the cleanest possible summary of what he had done to me while condemning it in grammar that still tried to keep the moral upper floor. Detective Ortiz moved first on him. 2 plainclothes officers came in from the side greenhouse door. One from the donor table. One from the volunteer check-in stand. They had been there the whole time, smiling into paper programs while the room admired orchids and river views and believed lunches remained lunches. Elise stepped back once, calculating distance. The calculation failed because she had spent so much time learning rooms as assets that she forgot rooms can also become cages when enough of the exits are occupied by people with warrants. Adam finally stood. Not for me. For her. He said, Elise. Just that one word. The old reflex. Reach for the center of the storm and imagine it can still recognize your voice as shelter. She turned on him with a face I had never seen in full because it had always been for private use. Cowardice looks almost exactly like contempt when the supporting structure falls away. You had one job, she said. There it was. Not grief. Not confusion. Not an unfortunate misunderstanding between family and advisors. A job. My nephew had been a function in a system she believed she designed perfectly. He said, you told me it would just make him sign. That sentence moved through the room like cold water. People remember that sort of line. Donors. Volunteers. Reporters. Detectives. The sentence that contains, all by itself, the scale of the excuse and the fact. Of the knowledge. Elise realized the damage the second it left his mouth. She tried to cover by moving louder. He is confused. Martin is confused. He has always been resistant to support. He is doing exactly what Dr. Voss warned would happen if he became agitated by outsiders. I stepped away from the podium then. Slowly. Deliberately. Down the 3 little stage steps Miriam had hated because she said even the best glasshouse architects still forgot older knees existed. I walked until I stood directly in front of Adam. The room stayed quiet enough that I could hear the citrus mister ticking on its timer over the east bed. He looked at me finally. There are sights I do not wish on anyone, and one of them is the face of a man you once taught to tie knots when he understands he has become smaller in your eyes than he ever believed possible. I said, how long were you willing to watch me disappear before your $80,000 a year started feeling expensive? His mouth opened once. Closed. Opened again. No answer. Not because there wasn't one. Because some answers sound worse than silence and he knew it. Ruth Templeton later told me that was the point where half the room stopped thinking of him as weak and started thinking of him as guilty. Not because of the money. Because he could not deny its size. While Ortiz cuffed Dr. Voss near the lemon tree bench, Samuel Pike projected the email timeline onto the back glazing curtain. Yes. That part had been my choice. Naomi would have settled for the legal red and the arrests. I wanted them to see it. The shell registration. The payment advance. The capacity language. The option retainer. Dr. Voss's note to Elisa's private address reading, if the subject remains compliant through the luncheon, we can finalize formal diminished capacity recommendations by Wednesday. I wanted the words made visible under the same greenhouse roof Miriam had kept alive through drought, frost, donor fatigue, and 3 separate board presidents who believed the answer to every problem was a gala. That was my revenge. Not only that the law arrived. That the law arrived after their own sentences had already stepped out ahead of them in public and introduced the room to who they were. Elliot went pale the way bland men do. Even his fear looked administrative. Dr. Voss tried to request counsel before they had his wrists fully secured, which would have impressed me more if he had not spent 6 weeks writing medical impressions designed to steal another man's speech. Elise held out longest. She kept talking. That is another thing certain controllers do once exposed. They do not collapse. They narrate. They narrate so hard they hope reality will get tired before they do. I was preserving the property, she said to the room at large. Ask any serious land manager. Ask any donor in this building whether founder decline is not exactly how great properties are lost. Martin was unraveling. Adam was trying to save what his aunt built. I prevented a disaster. No one answered her. And because nobody answered, she made the mistake that finished her even beyond the warrants. She pointed at the scholarship papers Nora had set beside the trust and said, that clause is vindictive. Miriam knew exactly how to punish family who disagreed with her. That sentence sounds mild on its face. It was fatal. Because you do not call a clause vindictive unless you already knew it existed. And according to every document Elliot and Elise had submitted to Fairmarsh, they had not reviewed the original amended trust in full when they began planning transition. They had merely acted on current stewardship summaries. Naomi heard it first. Of course she did. She looked at Ortiz and gave the smallest nod. There are whole rooms changed by nods that size. The question of premeditated knowledge about the integrity provision, and therefore conscious decision to move against it anyway, became part of the probable cause web before dessert plates had been cleared. It was, I admit, deeply satisfying. You learn strange things about yourself when betrayed. One of mine is that I have no objection to someone destroying themselves with their own mouth if they were hoping to use mine as the final tool against me. The room did not empty quickly after the arrests. People imagine exposure creates instant motion. Chairs scraping. Doors opening. Gasps turning into the purposeful noise of aftermath. Sometimes it does. This room held for a while. Volunteers remained by their tables with hands on linen and eyes too wide. Donors looked down at their programs as if the card stock might provide instructions on how to behave when a memorial lunch becomes evidence. The Shoreline magazine writer kept taking notes even after the photographer from the local paper lowered his camera and simply watched, human before professional for once. Outside the greenhouse, the river kept doing what the river had been doing all day. That offended me and comforted me both. The world outside glass never agrees to pause simply because inside the glass someone's family finally shows its whole face. Ruth stayed near me until the officers led Elise out. When Elise passed our table she switched, for the first time all afternoon, into a tone almost intimate. Martin, she said, you will regret this when the board tears itself apart. It was the purest version of her I ever heard. No innocence. No concern. Just threat with better posture. I answered, my wife built the board to survive smarter people than you. Ruth squeezed my forearm so hard it nearly hurt because she knew exactly how much that one sentence cost me and returned. Adam did not leave with Elise. Not because he was innocent. Because the structure around him was different by then. Naomi had already separated his exposure from hers in the rough outline that matters first. Cooperation potential. Financial inducement trail. Recorded admissions. Enough guilt to charge, enough weakness to leverage. That is the ugly arithmetic of prosecution and also, sometimes, justice. He sat alone for almost 20 minutes after they took the others. No one joined him. That image haunts me in a different register than the rest. Not because I pity him most there. Because loneliness is the first honest thing that reached him after months of letting himself be crowded by other people's plans. When the room finally began to move, it moved around me instead of through me. Ortiz took me to the little propagation alcove behind the West citrus beds for the initial statement. Naomi joined us with a legal pad. Nora Bellamy handled the board, who looked as though someone had knocked the entire concept of governance sideways under their feet. Samuel Pike dismantled the podium mic with the reverence of a man unhooking explosives. Dr. Morgan, who had attended quietly under the title of donor wellness consultant just in case I needed medical intervention, came in long enough to check my pulse and tell me I was standing too stiffly. She was right. Once the room no longer required my spine to act as a flagpole, my body started collecting all the stress it had postponed for public use. I shook. Not visibly to others, I think, but deep enough that my back teeth felt it. Ruth brought tea. Real tea. Not anything from a bottle or tin or careful little brown dropper. Hot, tannic, strong enough to have opinions. June Bell arrived as the room was thinning and the board was moving into emergency session in the archive office. She looked at the empty podium, the dismantled microphone, and me standing there still in the navy suit Miriam once liked on me because it made my shoulders look less tired, and she said, well. She did choose correctly. Meaning Miriam. Meaning the clause. Meaning me, I hoped, though I did not ask because some questions are made smaller by requesting confirmation. The board invoked the integrity provision before 5 o'clock. That timing mattered because East Quay's option money died with the revocation once notified, and Nora Bellamy wanted the notice in motion before Fairmarsh could start turning administrative delay into cover. By 6, the conservancies. Governance converted exactly as Miriam had designed it. Public stewardship stayed with the board. Family benefit vanished. The scholarship endowment activated. A fund I did not know had already been partially capitalized through a donor reserve Miriam established quietly in the year before her diagnosis now had fresh life and a legal engine behind it. She had not just protected the land. She had arranged for the betrayal, if it ever came, to become fertilizer for children who had nothing to do with it. That still feels like the most Miriam thing in the whole story. Not that she trapped greed. That she made the trap nourish somebody worthier afterward. By 7:30 the greenhouse was empty except for broken table settings, wilting tulips, a wineglass cracked at the base near the donor podium, and 3 exhausted women who loved Miriam in different disciplines. Ruth sweeping linen clips into a tray. June stacking programs. Nora on the phone with a clerk who sounded afraid of her, which likely meant Nora was doing exactly the right kind of work. I stood under the east span and looked up at the iron ribs disappearing into the late light. You spend enough years fixing structures and you learn this. The moment after a collapse is not silence. It is assessment. What still bears? What can be saved? What new loads the frame must carry now that the false parts are gone? That was me under Miriam's glasshouse that evening. Not triumphant. Not ruined. Assessing. Then Adam walked back in. No one stopped him because Ortiz had allowed it and because all the formal things were still sorting themselves. He stood 10 feet away, damp hair fallen forward, tie loosened, eyes emptied out in the way people think grief looks like until they meet actual grief and understand guilt has a different shape. "Can I speak to you?" he said. June and Ruth both turned at once. Good women. Protective women. Women who had, by then, taken my continued existence as a personal administrative priority. I said yes. Not because I owed him the room. Because I wanted to hear what the first words after public failure would be when there was no longer anything left to win. We stepped into the West Service corridor between the potting room and the old boiler annex. He said, "I never thought she would push it this far." That was his opening sentence. Not "I am sorry." Not "I did this." That line. I nearly walked away then, because if a man still speaks first about what he did not think someone else would do, he is still hiding in the shadow of shared blame. But I stayed. He looked older in that service corridor than he had looked at the donor tables. Public failure ages men quickly when vanity has been doing some of the cosmetic work. I told myself it was about management, he said. Then it was about stabilizing debt. Then it was about getting through the spring. Every time I thought I'd stop it, there was already another piece moving. I said, "That is not the sentence you use when you want forgiveness. That is the sentence you use when you still hope process will thin your responsibility." He flinched. Good. Pain without clarity becomes self-pity. Pain with clarity may still become a person. He asked whether I hated him. I answered honestly. Not cleanly enough to make my life easier. That was all I had for him then. He cried after that. Quietly. Shoulders in. Hands over face the way he used to do as a boy when he had done something shameful at school and still wanted the world to remain available afterward. I did not touch him. That detail also matters. Love after betrayal cannot begin by lying to the body. My body did not trust him then. So I did not teach it another false lesson by pretending. At the end I said, "Do not come to the house until I ask. Do not speak to the press. Do not use Miriam's name in public once in your defense. If you want any future with me at all, you will begin there." He nodded. Then he left through the side orchard path where he had once raced wheelbarrows as a teenager and kissed his first girl badly by the tool shed and learned to graft pear scions under Miriam's supervision because she said no boy in her care would leave adolescence without at least one honest skill. The path looked the same. That is one of the more cruel facts about aftermath. The physical routes remain loyal to memory long after the people walking them have broken rank with it. The search warrants on Elisa's office, Dr. Voss's clinic, and Fairmarsh's River County correspondence turned the week after the luncheon into a different sort of violence. Public exposure is theatrical. Search warrant returns are administrative. Boxes. Drives. Printouts. Photos in evidence sleeves. Typed summaries of all the little private efficiencies by which one human being planned to hollow out another. Detective Ortiz did not shield me from the findings, but she delivered them in portions, which I appreciated more than I could say then. The first portion was the easiest to understand and the hardest to forgive. A spreadsheet. Not poisoning notes. Not murder fantasies. A spreadsheet called Transition Readiness. It listed my sleep patterns, likely visitor windows, neighbor observations, donor calendar conflicts, Dr. Voss screening dates, Adam's debt exposure, board member personalities, and a color-coded probability line on whether subject gratitude remains intact. Subject gratitude. That was the phrase under which my loneliness had been filed. I stared at that line a long time. Elise had not merely planned around my body. She had planned around my manners. My reluctance to offend people. My widower's embarrassment around being looked after. My habit of saying thank you even when uncomfortable. All the civil little virtues that had helped me stay decent after Miriam died had been entered into a workbook as usable pressure points. I asked Ortiz whether that sort of thing still surprised her. She said, no. What still surprises me is how often the people doing it believe they are the practical ones in the story. The second portion was worse. Dr. Voss had drafted two versions of my decline narrative. A shorter one for board circulation. A longer one for emergency court filing if resistance increased. In version 2, he described me as exhibiting legacy fixation, impaired executive judgment tied to bereavement rigidity, and increasing vulnerability to undue influence by nostalgic community actors. Nostalgic community actors. That meant Ruth. June. Half the volunteers. Any person likely to tell me I still belong to myself. There are lies so ugly they become almost elegant in their structure. Voss had built one of those. A medical sounding machine designed to strip away every witness who loved me by reclassifying love itself as destabilizing interference. The third portion came from Fairmarsh. Elliot Cranesby had circulated internal memos characterizing the conservancy as emotionally encumbered real estate with aging founder risk. The recommended solution was expedited founder support, private family alignment, medical reassurance, then discreet conversion before public sentiment attached too strongly to the existing governance model. Expedited founder support. I asked Naomi Rees whether white-collar men train somewhere to speak like undertakers hired by consultants. She said yes, likely at tuition rates no decent parent should pay. Adam cooperated on the fourth day. Not from nobility. Let that be clean. From collapse. Elise had thrown him away the moment his usefulness changed shape. Fairmarsh's counsel had no interest in carrying his debt-soaked conscience once the state got teeth into the timeline. He came in through his attorney looking hollowed out and offered everything. Every email. Every debt notice. Every conversation where he said no and then failed to keep saying it. Every point where Elise reframed murder into management and theft into transition and his own fear into burden. I read the interview transcript later in Nora's office with the river moving slow beyond the courthouse windows. The line that stayed with me most was not one of the dramatic ones. It was this. I got used to hearing her talk about him like he was already historical. Historical. As if I were a property phase. A founder portrait. A speech at the beginning of a brochure before the real monetizable version began. That was how Adam finally understood the scale of what he had joined. Not when I shook. Not when the doctor wrote. Not when he signed into River Lantern. When he heard Elise talk about me as if I were an obstacle already finished by time, just waiting for paperwork to catch up. Weak men often need to hear their own future spoken in a cruel enough voice before they notice they are helping write it. June came by that Friday with apple cake and a photograph I had never seen. Miriam at 31, standing knee-deep in the river mud during the first conservancy drainage survey, one boot half sunk, hair loose, laughing straight at the camera because I had sworn the old tide gate would hold and it had not. She was holding a rolled easement map like a weapon and had that look on her face that always came when she was tired and delighted at the same time. June set the photograph on my kitchen table and said, she thought you would need proof she was difficult before she was sainted. I laughed then. The first unguarded laugh since Bennett Hardware. Nobody sainted her while she was alive. That is why now they all want to, June said. Dead women get turned into agreeable language so quickly it ought to be a municipal service. Then she told me something Miriam had said during the trust rewrite that I had not known and wish I had. If Adam ever comes after the place through Martin, do not let Martin spend the rest of his life thinking kindness failed him. Tell him I knew kindness would not be enough and built the rest anyway. I had to stand up after June said that because sitting with it hurt too cleanly. Not that Miriam predicted betrayal. That she predicted how I would blame myself for not seeing it in time. A good marriage leaves you with grief. A great one also leaves you with instructions precise enough to still save you when the person issuing them has been dead nearly 2 years. That night, alone in the house, I opened the drawer where Miriam kept her field notebooks. I had not opened it since the funeral because grief makes saints and thieves out of drawers. You either preserve them too completely or raid them for proof the dead once needed normal things. I had done neither. I had simply refused. Inside lay 30 years of small black books. Weather notes. Donor names. Orchard yields. Boiler quirks. Children who broke rules. Gardeners she liked. Gardeners she pretended to like. Board members who mistook fundraising for stewardship. All of Miriam, in the quick square hand she used when she loved accuracy more than appearance. On the inside cover of the last one, the year before she got sick, she had written a single line. If I die first, Martin will think endurance is a strategy. Remind him it is only half of one. I sat there with the notebook open and the house around me doing its ordinary little night sounds and understood something I had been too male and too stubborn to see most of my life. Miriam did not love me because I endured. She loved me enough to know endurance needed witnesses, plans, and occasionally traps. The criminal case moved both faster and slower than people think such things move. Faster in the moral sense. Once the story was public, everyone in Port Canaan decided within 48 hours what had happened and who deserved what. Coastal towns are excellent at three things: weather gossip, quiet charities, and instant moral sorting as long as the facts arrive with enough money attached to justify interest. Slower in the legal sense. Motions. Continuances. Forensic supplements. Privilege fights. Defense filings trying to relabel deliberate chemical coercion as overzealous caregiving. Voss's attorney floated the phrase non-traditional compliance support in open court with a straight face, and I remember thinking there ought to be a separate sentencing enhancement for language that obscene. Elise was charged hard and early. Attempted assault by toxic administration. Conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Fraud tied to incapacity-based transfer. Dr. Voss lost his license before the preliminary hearing. Elliot Cranesby resigned from Fairmarsh, which is corporate language for we would prefer he drown somewhere quiet and not use our towels on the way out. Adam's position remained the one that most complicated people's appetite for simple hatred. The town wanted clean categories. Monster. Victim. Widow's legacy. Snake in the grass. But Adam sat in the middle of motives and had the worst sort of partially human defense. He had loved me. He had needed money. He had let a woman smarter in predation than he was in morals turn his debt into a bridge. He had said no twice. He had said yes on the third campaign. He had then continued saying yes in smaller forms until the whole machine existed around him and his own resistance felt like a childish luxury he could no longer afford. None of that made him innocent. It did make him mine in a way punishment alone could not simplify. The state's offer came in late summer. Plea to conspiracy and attempted financial exploitation. Full cooperation. No prison if the testimony held clean and complete. Probation, restitution, mandatory treatment, barred financial management roles, barred contact without my consent. Naomi explained it in her office with the kind of tone prosecutors use when they know law and justice will overlap but not perfectly. He is more useful against the architecture than inside a cell with other men telling himself he was really the least guilty person in the room, she said. That sentence annoyed me because it was intelligent and therefore harder to reject. I asked for time. Naomi gave it. Ruth wanted prison. June wanted truth first and then consequences fitted to what truth had exposed. Nora wanted the plea signed fast before a jury could be confused by the human shape of Adam's weakness and start bargaining emotionally with facts already well documented. Dr. Morgan, who surprised me by caring at all beyond medicine, said, "Whatever you decide, do not let your body's relief at surviving write your moral answer for you. Survival gratitude makes men generous in directions they later regret." That is an extraordinary sentence. I wrote it down. In the end I did not bless the plea. I permitted it. That difference mattered to me. The law did not need my blessing. It needed my statement that I understood the terms and would not obstruct them. I gave that and nothing more. Some people call that cold. They are usually the people not being asked to sort affection from complicity with a pen in their hand. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning in September under fluorescent lights so harsh everybody looked less innocent than perhaps they deserved. Adam wore a dark suit I had helped him buy 8 years earlier for a donor dinner at the conservancy. That detail nearly finished me more than the charges. Not because of symbolism. Because it was practical. He had taken the best suit he owned to court, and the best suit he owned was still one I had paid for with Miriam standing beside me approving the tie like there would be endless normal dinners to attend afterward. He stood when the clerk called his name and answered in a voice more solid than I expected. No tremor. No performance. No self-excuse built into the cadence. That, more than anything, let me sit through it. When the judge asked whether he understood the conduct at issue involved a coordinated plan to chemically impair and administratively displace me for private financial benefit, Adam said yes. When asked whether he understood he had materially assisted that plan after awareness of its purpose, he said yes again. Those are small words. They cost enough when said correctly. After the hearing his attorney approached Naomi to confirm probation logistics and next dates. I remained seated on the wooden bench outside the courtroom because my knees had decided they were 70 and would now like acknowledgement. Adam did not come to me first. Also good. He waited until his attorney nodded that he could. Then he crossed the corridor and stopped 5 feet away. That distance was respectful. I note it because respect from the guilty often begins as geometry before it becomes anything more meaningful. I'll testify clean, he said. Not please believe me. Not I never meant. I'll testify clean. That was the only useful promise available, and he knew it. I said, you owe the dead better than you owe me. Start there. He nodded. Then, after a pause long enough to prove he had almost kept quiet, he said, do you think Aunt Miriam ever knew? I looked at him a long time before answering because he deserved the truth and the truth in that corridor had edges. She knew enough to plan for you, I said. She never stopped hoping she would prove herself overly cautious. That hit him harder than the plea had. Good again. Hope is heavier than hatred when it lands on the guilty. Hatred lets them identify themselves as condemned. Hope asks what they did with love before ruining it. He started to cry then but controlled it, which in that courthouse felt more adult than letting it run for display. I did not comfort him. But I also did not turn away. That was where we were by September. Not forgiveness. Not severance. A corridor wide enough for future language if earned. Nothing more. When I got home that afternoon the river was running steel blue under early fall light and the first of the orchard pears had begun dropping in the south row. The Conservancy Board had already voted unanimously to name the new trade scholarship after Miriam and the waterfront apprenticeship grants after the old millwright program I once built for high school boys who preferred wrenches to literature. It embarrassed me, which is how I knew it was generous and not merely flattering. The endowment grew after the scandal in the odd way public money sometimes grows when shame and admiration collide. Donors who had once hovered politely at the edge of giving wrote checks big enough to alter timelines. 2 local contractors sponsored the first apprenticeship year. The school district offered bus support for greenhouse classes. The town paper ran a piece titled, not very elegantly, Widow's Trap Saves Shoreline Landmark, which Miriam would have hated for the word widow and secretly enjoyed for the word trap. We did not correct it. By October the Conservancy had more future than it had before Elise ever stepped into my kitchen with soup. Elisa's sentencing came in November under a sky so colorless it looked like a page waiting for somebody else to decide whether weather would happen on it at all. I had not planned to attend. That surprises people when I tell them. They imagine revenge as appetite. If you were betrayed, surely you want the front row for punishment. Surely you want the visible collapse. The tremor in the hands. The explanation nobody asked for. The tears arriving too late to reduce the invoice. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you are simply tired. I was tired enough by then that the thought of another room arranged around her face felt like a task rather than a reward. June changed my mind. Go, she said over tea in my kitchen. Not because she deserves your witness. Because a man who survives this sort of thing should hear the law use the right nouns while he is still alive enough to know what it costs. She was right, of course. June often was in ways that made argument feel decorative. So I went. Elise wore gray. Not prison gray. Expensive public contrition gray. The sort of color lawyers choose when they want a woman who measured her life in surfaces to look as if surfaces have stopped mattering. Her hair was plain. Her jewelry minimal. Her face almost untouched by makeup. It was the visual equivalent of a reduced sentence motion. The judge saw through none of that or all of it. I could not tell which. Good judges are hard to read for the same reason good mechanics are. They have long since learned performance is cheaper than parts and treat both accordingly. The prosecutor read the impact statement pieces in sequence. Toxicology. Capacity manipulation. Recorded admissions. Financial conversion structure. The integration of medical language into a coercive property strategy. Then my own statement, which Naomi had asked me to keep short and factual. I wrote it myself. I said that what Elise attempted was not merely to harm my body, though she did that. Not merely to steal land, though she tried that too. She attempted to remove my authority over my own reality in my dead wife's house so that every future sentence I spoke about myself could be reviewed, doubted, and managed by the people profiting from my decline. I said there are thefts of money, and then there are thefts of personhood, and the second sort leaves the larger repair bill. That was the line the local paper quoted the next day. I know because Ruth clipped it before breakfast and left the clipping under my sugar bowl without a note. Elise spoke before sentencing. She did not apologize to me first. That told me everything remained exactly as I had understood it. She apologized to the court for the complexity this matter created. Then to Adam for allowing private strain to distort public judgment. Then, finally, to me for the fear and confusion that resulted. As if the fear and confusion were weather produced by unfortunate conditions rather than goals built into the blueprint. I watched her speak and realized I no longer needed the performance to fail because it had already succeeded at the wrong task. It had shown me, completely, how little of her interior had ever included the possibility of another person's full reality. She was not there to ask forgiveness. She was there to improve the texture of consequence. When the judge said years instead of months, Elise finally broke shape. Not loudly. Not even visibly to most of the room. But I had watched people under strain my entire working life. Bearings before fracture. Shafts before wobble. Men before admitting the machine had been too hot too long. The little shift in her shoulders was enough. Her body had expected one kind of future and just learned another one had outranked it. I did not feel joy. That is the honest answer. I felt proportion. That is rarer and, in my experience, more durable. Dr. Voss's sentence came later and mattered less to me emotionally, which surprised me until I understood why. He was a technician of harm. Elise had been the imagination. Elliot the translation. Adam the weak hinge. But Elise had been the one who looked at the shape of my ordinary lonely life and thought, efficiently, yes, this can be turned. Some crimes are committed first in worldview and only later in action. After sentencing, outside the courthouse, Adam asked if he could speak to me for 5 minutes. Not as family. That was how he phrased it. As the man who helped do it. I said yes because the precision in his request earned at least that much room. We stood under the overhang while reporters stayed respectfully 30 feet off because Naomi had privately made it clear my tolerance for spectacle was exhausted and any microphone shoved toward me would be remembered unfavorably in future access. Adam said he had started treatment. Debt counseling, individual therapy, group work for coercive relationships and financial dependency, which sounded to me both terribly modern and entirely appropriate. He did not try to sell the process as redemption. Also good. Then he said, I keep hearing the sentence you said in the service corridor. About love and appetite. I waited. I think I built my whole adult life assuming love from people who knew me early would keep reabsorbing what I did wrong. That is an extraordinary sentence for a man like Adam to reach without help. Not absolution worthy. Just true. I said, then maybe your life can start now that you know it won't. He cried a little. Not much. The weather helped him. Cold air makes men look wetter than they are. Then he asked the question I had expected for months and dreaded. Anyway. Do you think there will ever be a way back? Not home. Not to the house. A way back. I answered with the only honesty I had. There might be a way forward that still includes me. Do not insult either of us by calling it back. He nodded once. We left it there. I got in my truck afterward and did not start it right away. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and watched courthouse traffic move through the November gray and thought about how often people talk about closure as if it were a door that shuts cleanly. Nothing in me shut that day. Something aligned. That is different. Closure pretends there is an end to carrying. Alignment simply means the weight now sits in the right place on your back. Winter passed in work. Not healing, exactly. Work. People confuse those two because sometimes they arrive wearing each other's coats. I repaired the north greenhouse vent chain in December because it had been slipping half a tooth since summer and Miriam would have noticed sooner and insulted me for pretending otherwise. I rebuilt the boathouse ramp in January with 2 apprentices from the first scholarship class because there is no cleaner answer to attempted theft than teaching boys with rough hands how to preserve what greedy people thought only had resale value. I cleared stormfall in the orchard. Rehung the south gate. Recaulked the riverside windows in the main house. Normal work. Useful work. Work with splinters and level lines and measurable outcomes. Work that does not ask you whether you have forgiven anyone before it lets the day move forward. The scholarship class started in February. 6 students. 3 from Port Canaan. 2 from Bridge Harbor. 1 girl from inland who wore steel-toe boots she had bought at a thrift shop and listened with such furious concentration I would have hired her at 19 over half the men I spent my career beside. We taught them glazing basics, pump maintenance, orchard rigging, shoreline retaining work, and the old mill alignment math I thought had died out with the last of the proper plant foremen. The first morning they arrived, I stood at the greenhouse entrance under the hand-carved cedar sign that still read Miriam Hanley Shoreline Conservancy and watched them walk up the shell path carrying notebooks and thermoses and the unearned certainty young people sometimes have that a new thing will accept them if they arrive on time. It nearly took me apart. Not because the line from betrayal to scholarship was poetic. I am suspicious of poetry when money is involved. Because it was practical. Elise had looked at the conservancy and seen a convertible asset. Miriam had looked at the possibility of betrayal and built a machine that would turn the attempted theft into wages, tools, and trade hours for children who had never once eaten at my table or walked through my kitchen pretending concern. That is not poetry. That is engineering. June took over the archive room officially that spring with Ruth as assistant, though Ruth insisted the title should be deputy nuisance and June said she would enter it that way in the volunteer ledger if it kept her quiet. Dr. Morgan joined the board in an advisory seat because after all of it she said she had acquired an emotional grudge against badly supervised heritage properties and wanted an outlet. Nora remained counsel. Samuel Pike donated a new sound system after saying the old one had embarrassed him personally. The board became better, not holier, which is the only upgrade I trust in institutions. As for me, I learned where the damage had landed in slower ways. The first time anyone touched my wrist unexpectedly, I jerked back hard enough to knock over a crate of Bartlett pears. The first time a volunteer set herbal tea beside my elbow without warning, I had to walk outside and stand by the river until my breathing stopped sounding like somebody else's problem. The first time Dr. Morgan prescribed me anything after the case, she wrote the compound name out, showed me the sealed bottle, and asked whether I wanted Ruth or June present. While I opened it, I did not. But I loved her for understanding why the offer mattered. Survival after this kind of thing is less noble than people think. It is repetitive. You relearn an ordinary body one small permission at a time. I stopped taking anything from unopened packages brought by guests. I kept my own tea tins labeled in thick marker. I wrote appointments in 2 places. I cooked more. Badly at first. Then adequately. Then one Sunday in March I made Miriam's leek tart without looking at the notebook and had to sit down halfway through because my hands would not stop shaking long enough to finish the egg wash. Not from grief. From return. Some returns hurt because they prove the road back was never blocked by incapacity. It was blocked by theft, and theft always leaves a cleaner rage once the gate reopens. Adam wrote every month. That was part of the agreement we reached through Naomi and his therapist after sentencing terms settled into their long machinery. No visits. No surprise calls. No language of family obligation. A written account of what he had done that month to repair the parts of himself that had made the earlier version possible. He sent proof of counseling attendance, debt restructuring, restitution payments into the scholarship fund, and once, unexpectedly, a handwritten page about the first time he noticed Elise describing older homeowners as unlock events and how he had laughed because he thought she meant estate transitions and not people. I read every letter. Not because he deserved an audience. Because I deserved evidence. Evidence that the man I almost lost my life to, not directly but through cowardice and greed and borrowed language, was either becoming something better or failing in a measurable way. So far, he has not failed in the measurable ways. That is as generous as I am willing to be while remaining accurate. In April, on the first warm Saturday after the river lost its winter steel and began flashing silver again in the afternoons, he asked through a letter whether he could attend the public plant sale if he stayed anonymous, bought his own ticket, said nothing to me, and left after 1 hour. I said yes. Some people will hear that and think forgiveness arrived there. It did not. What arrived was curiosity strong enough to stand in the same weather as consequences. He came in a work jacket and cap and moved through the sale like a man visiting the museum of his own collapse. Nobody recognized him except June, who recognizes everything, and Ruth, who would have recognized him from orbit if given decent binoculars. They behaved. Also notable. I watched him from the far end of the herb tables while pretending to explain irrigation valves to one of the scholarship students. He bought 2 rosemary starts and a packet of climbing bean seed Miriam used to hand out free to children because, she said, no child should learn food only as something inside fluorescent stores. Adam stood for a long time by the scholarship board where the names of the first trade class had been lettered beneath Miriam's photograph. Then he left exactly on the hour. He did not try to find me. That restraint did more for him than any speech could have. Later June said, well. That was all. I understood. Sometimes the highest available praise is 1 syllable and no interference. If you have stayed with me this far, near the end of a long road like this, keep listening closely, because this is the part where most stories would rush toward a simple hug, a funeral, or a slammed door. Real endings are usually quieter than that. Most of us live in the quieter middle. The middle is where the real work is. In May I finally took down the blue tin shelf in the pantry. Not the evidence tin. That stayed where the county kept it until the appeals window closed. I mean the little cedar shelf Elise had complimented so often, the one by the spice cabinet where she always set down her teas and supplements like a careful bride arranging a better life 1 bottle at a time. I removed the shelf, sanded the wall patch, and painted over the pale square it had hidden from smoke and years. Ruth asked why I bothered when the square would have darkened on its own in a few months. Because I don't want time doing a job I can do on purpose, I said. That is the sort of sentence age gives you if you survive long enough and pay attention while it does. June came over the afternoon I finished painting and brought the photograph of Miriam in the river mud back because she said it was mine now, not archived material, and because the archive already had too much of Miriam the public woman and not enough of the version who laughed when tide gates failed and boots vanished to the ankle. We stood in the kitchen trying to decide where to hang it. Not by the old donor board photo. Too official. Not in the library. Too private. We chose the hall between the back porch and the greenhouse door. The passage Miriam used most. The place where work and home met and kept crossing each other all her life. When I drove the nail in, June said, "There. Now she can watch the useful traffic." I think Miriam would have liked that. Useful traffic. Apprentices through the greenhouse door. Students with gloves tucked in pockets. Ruth carrying tulip starts and gossip. June with archive boxes. Dr. Morgan with one shoulder turned against the wind and coffee in both hands. Me, most mornings, forgetting for a second to ache. That hallway changed the house. Not because it added a picture. Because it corrected a map. Until then the house had become too much shrine and not enough workshop. Grief is always trying to convert living structures into museums if no one interrupts it in time. The final thing I built that year was not part of any board plan, donor budget, or legal repair. It was a bench. Cedar frame. White oak slats. Iron brackets cut from salvaged greenhouse brace stock too old and too honest to throw away. I built it in the boathouse over 3 slow Saturdays in June because there was an empty place on the South River path where Miriam used to stop with the schoolchildren before they turned toward the marsh overlook. She would make them stand still there and describe what the tide was doing without using the words pretty or nice. She said useless language made lazy eyes. I set the bench facing west, where late light catches the broad water and turns every moving line into a temporary path. On the inside edge of the back rail, where only someone sitting there would find it, I carved 6 words. Leave greed with the tide. Not because Miriam ever said exactly that. Because she would have approved the sentiment and corrected the punctuation. We dedicated nothing. There was no ribbon. No plaque. No donor naming right. Just a bench in the place it belonged because sometimes a thing should enter the world quietly if quiet is strong enough to keep it. Ruth brought lemonade and declared the left rear leg was a 16th too proud on the gravel. She was right. June brought seed cake and said she hoped I understood that if I died before she did, she was taking the photograph in the hall whether I liked it or not because she refused to let another generation mistake Miriam for polite. Dr. Morgan came late and in work clothes and sat on the new bench without asking, which is how I knew it was good. At dusk the scholarship students arrived after their workshop cleanup, still smelling faintly of soil and hydraulic oil and river humidity. The girl in the thrift shop boots, whose name was Talia, ran her hand along the bench back and asked who it was for. I said, everyone who still belongs to themselves when they sit down. She looked at me a second longer than young people usually look at old men before deciding whether they said something serious or strange. Then she nodded as if the answer had landed where it needed to and sat anyway. That evening, after everyone left, the river held the last of the light in flat broken strips and I stayed on the bench alone. Not lonely. Alone. Those are different countries. My phone buzzed just once in my pocket. Adam. Only a photograph. No caption. He had planted the rosemary starts he bought at the sale in 2 chipped clay pots on what looked like the little condo balcony where he now lived after the bigger life came apart. One pot was already struggling because he had overwatered it. The other looked sturdy enough to survive his education. I stared at the photo a while. Then I wrote back 3 words. Less water. More sun. That was all. No blessing. No fatherly sign-off. No opening of old language. Just a true instruction about a living thing. It felt right. Later that night I stood in the kitchen with the windows open to the river air and looked at the photograph of Miriam in the hallway. She was still laughing at the failed tide gate. Still young. Still impossible to reduce to the tidy saint people wanted after a woman dies protecting something beautiful. And I thought about all the versions of her I had met again in the months after the luncheon. The archivist. The strategist. The angry careful lawyer in gardening gloves. The woman who loved me enough to know endurance alone would one day get me killed if nobody stood beside it with a plan. I had spent the first year after her death talking to her memory like a man speaking into weather. By that summer I had stopped asking the weather for answers. I had the bench. The students. The scholarship. The greenhouse. The river path. June alive and rude and faithful. Ruth still correcting my measurements. Dr. Morgan still suspicious of anything sold in a blue tin. The trust intact. The land public. The trap sprung exactly the way Miriam designed it. The house mine. Myself, still mine. That is more than some people get after betrayal. It is enough. Sometimes people ask me now whether I am glad it happened the way it did. No. That is a foolish question and I do not answer it politely anymore. I am not glad a woman studied my manners as a delivery path. I am not glad a doctor wrote decline around me like a net. I am not glad the boy I raised chose money slowly enough to keep thinking he had not chosen it yet. What I am is grateful for three things. That an old woman in a quilted coat overheard the right sentence and kept a promise. That my wife loved me in a style sharp enough to anticipate my blind spots. And that I paid attention before kindness turned fully into a signature. Danger rarely arrives wearing danger's clothes. It arrives in soups, scheduling, concern, little phrases about easing burdens, improving continuity, simplifying next steps, helping with the bills, checking your memory, making things easier, wanting what is best. That is why you must pay attention earlier than feels polite. Trust the discomfort that has not learned its vocabulary yet. Notice who keeps checking whether you are tired. Notice who names your limitations before you do. Notice who speaks of your future as if your role in it is already decorative. And never let anyone use your gratitude as proof you owe them access. That may be the only broad lesson in this entire story worth offering strangers. Everything else is local. My river. My house. My almost son. My dead wife. My blue tin. My blackened spoon. My greenhouse full of witnesses. Your life will arrange the details differently. But the mechanism, that part is common enough to be worth saying aloud. Pay attention when concern begins to sound like management. Pay attention when management begins to sound like inevitability. And if the people closest to you ever begin speaking about your peace as though it requires your silence, leave the room before they decide silence for you. A year after the luncheon, on the exact date they expected me to surrender the conservancy, the board held the spring opening under the east greenhouse span again. Same tables. Same iron ribs. Same river light. Different future. There were no memorial speeches that year. No dark linens. No experts selling continuity. Just students showing the irrigation rebuild they had completed, schoolchildren carrying seed trays, the first scholarship cohort speaking too fast into a microphone because youth has not yet learned what adults mistake for gravitas, and June at the archive table correcting a donor's pronunciation of 19th century, as if civilization itself depended on the matter. I stood at the back for a long time where the service corridor opens near the potting room, the exact place Elise once told me my tremor had to remain consistent. The memory came cleanly and then passed. That is how I knew I was further along than I had admitted. Not because I forgot. Because the place belonged more to the living day in front of me than to the woman who once tried to turn it into a stage set for my removal. Toward evening Talia, the apprentice in the thrift shop boots, found me there and asked whether I wanted to see the new river pump housing. I said yes, and as we walked past the tables and down the shell path toward the service yard, I heard one of the little children ask his mother who Miriam Hanley was. The mother said, "She is the reason this place stayed for everybody." That answer pleased me. Not because it was complete. It was not. It left out the trap and the greed and the law and the chemistry and the bench and the old friend and the weak almost son and the dead wife's hard intelligence. But children do not need the whole machine at once. They need the clean line first. The rest is for grown people and late light and long stories. By the time the guests left, the river had gone bronze and soft. The greenhouse lights glowed up through the panes. The new students had stacked chairs. Ruth was arguing with the caterer over missing pie servers she absolutely had not stolen. June was locking the archive room. Dr. Morgan was on the bench by the south path talking to two donors about apprenticeship liability insurance with the kind of dry passion only very competent women ever make look attractive. I stood at the gate for a moment before closing up. The sign over the arch still read Miriam Hanley Shoreline Conservancy. The letters had weathered a little more. I ran my hand along the wood and thought about the first thing June said when I finally found her after the hardware store warning. "You tested it." "Yes. I tested it." That is the truest sentence in the whole story. Not only the balm. Everything. The care. The paperwork. The voices. The room. The inheritance of trust itself. I tested all of it in the only way that matters when the people closest to you begin hoping politeness will keep you from doubt. And because I tested it, the land is still public, the children still learn here, the river still belongs to itself, and the woman who built all of it with me still has the last word every spring when the east greenhouse fills again. That is enough for a man my age. More than enough, actually. It is a life returned in working order. Before I close this story, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from, your city or your country. If this story stayed with you, your comment helps me know that you walked all the way to the end with Martin, Miriam, June, and the land they fought to protect. And if you take nothing else from this story, take that. When something feels wrong in a familiar hand, test it before you explain it away. You may save more than your own life. You may save the part of the world someone trusted you to keep.